There are many challenges that girls in Africa face, and one of these challenges is an equal access to quality education and opportunities. Collective action is required to break the barriers that presently hold back girls, and with that, strong implementation plans are needed to make a positive difference in their education. Good day to you all and welcome to this special CNBC Africa broadcast on the theme Africa's Collective Future, Intentional Education for Girls. I am Fifi Peters. Our focus for today is the call for increased and intentional investment in the education of girls towards building resilience and inclusive, gender-responsive teaching skills. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has negatively impacted years of progress made towards the education of the girl child. The benefits of investing in the health and education of the girl child are far-reaching, and we'll be hearing from a panel of speakers who are making a difference in the teaching of girls across the continent. But before we do get to them, we welcome South Africa's Basic Education Minister.
Matsi Angelina Motshekga, Minister of Basic Education, South Africa.
My name is Matsi Angelina Motshekga, the Minister of Basic Education in South Africa. Since the advent of our first democratically elected government in South Africa, we have always been clear that investing in girls' education is one way of unblocking the traumatic experiences of the past to address inequality. We're very keen to unlock the great potential that could be achieved by households and families to escape the poverty trap through the decisive, intentional education for girls. Over the past 2 decades, the education sector has placed the girls' agenda at the center of care and support interventions for vulnerable children. We have successfully onboarded girls into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics learning streams, which has been predominantly a learning stream for boys previously. As such, with the right kind of support, girls have impressively competed and sometimes outperformed their boys' counterparts. Through the Techno-Girl program implemented with Techno-Girl Trust, we have been able to open career paths and expose girl learners to suitable careers choices that match the learning streams of mathematics, science, and technology. The British Council has supported the Department of Basic Education with the development and implementation of the Teacher Development Program called Teaching for All. Teaching for All is a diversity management intervention that is aimed at facilitating the inclusion of children in their diversity, including a gender-responsive teaching methodology. In addition, we have been supported by VVOB and our Sector Education and Training Authority to address the issues of gender-responsive pedagogy, even at early childhood education phase. We have received great support from the United Nations Children's Fund for the establishment and implementation of girls' education movement as a core curricular intervention for girl empowerment. The Global Fund Adolescent Girls and Young Women program has been one of the greatest investments towards turning the tide of HIV infection among girls, early unintended pregnancies, and school-related gender-based violence. All these endeavors have helped us to support the basic education system to remain true to Africa's collective effort towards intentional girls' education. The COVID-19 pandemic has, of course, threatened to undo all the girl education gains that we have achieved. However, in a post-COVID-19 era, we re-emerge with a renewed sense of purpose to be more intentional than ever before about girl education. We have got even closer to our girls through a series of webinar engagements and dialogues supported by the German Development Agency. As such, we are affirmed that we know now more that we used to about requirements to advance the response to the needs of girls, especially now in the post-COVID era. South Africa subscribes to the vision of a better Africa for girls, and I wish to thank you.
And thanks to Minister Angie Motshekga for those truly inspiring words. And we'll be actually looking at the theme, intentional education for girls, and fleshing out exactly what this means and what kind of action needs to be followed thereafter. But let's first meet our panel of experts that will be guiding us through the understanding the challenges currently facing education or girls in the education system, as well as the steps that have been taken to try and overcome the barriers, as well as the future plans to implement improvements.
And the panelists are Professor Vuyokazi Nomlomo, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Teaching and Learning at the University of Zululand, South Africa. Professor Aishatu Abdul-Isma'il of the Department of Political Science at Bayero University in Kano, Nigeria. Lina Anyango, Global Teacher Prize finalist from Kenya. Andrew Zerzan, Director Education, Arts and Civil Society, Sub-Saharan Africa, British Council.
And good afternoon to the panel. Great to be in your company discussing this very important topic for the continent. And I'd actually like to start by reflecting on what the pandemic has done. We've heard so far from the introductory remarks given by the Minister of Basic Education here in South Africa, the threat that the panel has posed to the progress, the pandemic rather has posed to the progress that has been made to advancing the girl child in the education system. So according to some reports, in fact, a generation of girls has been left behind potentially, which is pretty scary. And I feel like it should be at the core of any Build Back Better plans that economies on the continent do implement. And so I'll ask the panel to just reflect on this. And Professor Vuyo, good afternoon to you, ma'am. Perhaps if you can kick off the discussion for us. In your view, just looking at what the pandemic has done, is there any steps that can be taken at the stage to make up for some of the lost ground due to the pandemic's impact on girls in the education system?
Thank you very much, Fifi. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I think there's a lot that we have to do in terms of catching up with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic in our context. Firstly, I listened to the minister, and she was talking about a notion of teaching for all. And the minute I heard about that, I was just thinking about girls. I'll just be very brief, and I will talk from the perspective, from the South African perspective. And of course, I think what I'm going to say would be applicable in other contexts as well. Well, with regards to education, I know that there were times when there were lockdowns, and most of our learners, young learners, missed a lot of learning. They lost a lot of time. And as a result, we have seen that in the results of some of the assessments that have been done, that the results were not very good compared to the other years. So meaning that now there's a lot that we have to do in terms of catching up with the lost time. Particularly when it comes to literacy issues, particularly with regard to the young ones, that the early school, the early childhood children, you will realize that those young children from grade R, from the age of 6, let's say, to 9, are still starting to read and learning to write. And with the lost time, by the time they go back to the classrooms, they have lost all those a few skills that they have learned. And I think we've seen that happening in our context. So perhaps taking that further, coming to your question as what can we do? Because I think let's pass the stage now of posing problems and try to come up with solutions. we all know that the pandemic has been very disadvantageous, particularly from particularly to the groups, to the disadvantaged groups in the rural areas and in townships, in the poverty-stricken areas. It has been very, very disastrous. But I think with regard to trying to catch up, I think we have to make time in the classroom to ensure that yes, we emphasize the notion of teaching for all, but we must also emphasize the notion of learning for all. What do I mean by that? I think it links to what you have said from the beginning, Fifi, that we must apply an inclusive approach to all our educational endeavors. And how can we do that? I think the first issue that I want to refer to is that we need to realize the inequalities in our systems. And the first thing, especially with regard to the provisioning of resources, the urban schools are more resourced than the rural schools. And that on its own creates a problem with regards to equal access to education. So I think let's invest in the poor communities in terms of providing adequate resources and infrastructure. And that talks that talks also to the issue of girls, because if we don't have proper infrastructure, that also limits them from accessing schools, because some of them we know, especially in our African context, that perhaps when they have their menstrual periods, some of the girls do not go to schools.
Sure.
And some of the schools have poor infrastructure. And I think that is the starting point. And secondly, I also think that we also need to create awareness, especially in our communities, because there's also still gender stereotypes that are associated with socio-cultural practices where women are seen to be the bearers of all the chores at home, and that affects the learning of the girl child, because when they are at home, they are not given a chance, an opportunity to do their work, their schoolwork. They focus more on assisting, being in the kitchens, assisting the moms with household chores. And I think we need to create awareness starting at home about the importance of gender equality. And I think that the inequality stems from our socio-cultural practice.
Sure.
And the third level that I want to touch on before I leave the stage, the third level is in the classroom. I'm of the view that because, in our context, patriarchy dominates. And I think that follows the children to the classroom. What happens at home tends to follow the girl child up to the classroom. And what needs to happen, I think we need to create awareness within teacher education. When I'm talking about teacher education, I refer to pre-service and in-service to alert them of the value of gender equality in the way they interact with students, in their own practices, in their own pedagogies, to apply inclusive pedagogy so that everyone feels included, whether it's a boy or it's a girl. And that calls for innovation in the way they transfer knowledge and in the way they teach, so that they are responsive to the needs of both the boy and the girl child.
All right.
And finally, please, Fifi, with COVID-19, I think we've learned a lesson that most of the teaching and learning had to occur remotely, and that deserves proper training, particularly with regard to the acquisition of digital literacy, both by teachers and learners. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, ma'am. Thanks for those very insightful introductory remarks, and just summarizing some of the things that you said, just with regards to how we can potentially make up for some of the lost ground by the girl child and female learners that fallout the education system. You did highlight the importance of teaching for all and learning for all, which I quite liked. Just looking at the importance of investing in some of the infrastructure and resources, particularly for schools that are in the more poorer areas, and a very important one, I think, just looking at the role of inclusive teaching, but also the community's role in just addressing some of the stereotypes, the cultural norms in which it's the girl child that has to do a lot more housework, and after washing dishes and mopping the floors, the energy to read the book, I'm sure is not, there's not much energy left for that. But nonetheless, introductory remarks made very well by Professor Vuyo. And Ashantu, I'd like to come to you, ma'am, just in terms of the level of intervention that you think can be introduced into the system at this stage, just to deal with some of those learners that did drop out of the schooling system, and just as a result of the resources challenge. If you were to intervene at this juncture, what would your point of departure be?
Thank you very much, Bibi. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. Some of the interventions, as mentioned by Professor Vuyo, is that it's very, very important to ensure remote learning and distance learning facilities and devices are available for the girls. After COVID-19, we found that some governments in Nigeria and development partners, as well as NGOs, were trying to take along the girls, take along the children, so that this loss of learning that occurred could be bridged. But there are systemic issues in terms of not having the devices, radio, TV, computer, mobile phones, and if the devices are available, the power and energy required, internet services, data subscription. So what needs to be done is for the government to ensure that these facilities are made available, and also collaboration with development partners, with NGOs and government units, as well as individuals, as parents and community stakeholders, to ensure that the gap is bridged, and these facilities are made available,
sure,
either individually or in clusters, and alternative also programs are also provided.
Sure.
And it is also very, very important to ensure that the provision of these devices are made, as well as assist the children, the parents, to be able to assess these learning modules that are provided. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. Yeah, parents have certainly taken on a more important role in ensuring the education of all their children and the assessment thereof, particularly those who have been quite active in the learning process from home. I'd just like to encourage all our viewers who are joining us via the Hopin platform to complete their profile. Type on the chat where they are joining us from. It would be nice to know where you're coming from, as well as let us know if you have any teachers, or if we have any teachers rather, policymakers, young people on the call, funders or other decision makers. Again, those speakers who would love to engage with you, any of the speakers post the webinar, and you are just welcome to indicate and interact with them directly. Remember, we'll have that Q&A session towards the end of the actual discussion. But just circling back to the discussion, and Lina, I was looking at a video that you were filming filmed in which you made commentary of what had happened during the pandemic. And what had happened was the spike in pregnancies, right? Quite a number of teenage pregnancies. In fact, you were quoted as saying that in Kenya, it was a rapid increase over the period. And I'm just talking to you about these young girls that did become pregnant throughout the pandemic, who are now young mothers who are still in need of education. Just any thoughts on how we bring these young mothers back into the system, and how the schools and the institutions in themselves are also ready to receive them?
Yes, thank you very much. So it's true that during the COVID pandemic, we had a very high number of girls who became pregnant. And unfortunately, some of them had to drop out of school for some time. But thanks to the Ministry of Education policy of re-entry, where these girls are allowed to come back and join schooling. Now, this calls upon the school management, especially to help in implementing that government policy to give these girls a second chance in education. Of course, it's not easy being a parent and being a student at the same time. That's why there are several organizations, especially sponsored by UK, such as the Elimisha Project, which help to mentor these young mothers, counsel these young mothers, and even give financial support to these young mothers, so that even when they're in school, they're not worried about where they're going to get milk and diapers for their babies back at home.
All right. Okay. Andrew, just a last introductory remark from yourself. The theme for today, we're looking at intentional investments towards education for young girls. And I'd like to understand what your understanding of the definition intentional education is, and what kind of actions and steps need to back that up.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Fifi, to be here to talk about this incredibly important issue. You know, what we mean by intentional education for girls is that we're moving away from a sort of general gender-blind approach to education, in one that we're looking at the individual needs of students. And one of the largest groups, of course, is girls. We see girls across the African continent, and indeed many parts of the world, but I think it's particularly acute here, that girls are kept out of school. And when they are in school, they're often not looked after as well as boys. That results in girls falling behind. Falling behind girls means they often drop out. They get married early. Maybe they even get married as a child. They may even have a child themselves as a teenager. In fact, that's one of the biggest challenges to the COVID crisis that you referenced earlier. So I would say, you know, from my view, one of the top things we can do, the top interventions we can do, is something called teaching at the right level. And this is something that is done increasingly across Africa. The British Council does it in conjunction with UK Aid in northern Nigeria, a very tough environment in which nearly half of girls are married at a very, very young age, where you group students together based on their skill set, their ability at the time, their sort of experience at the time, rather than just by age. And this is quite a revolution currently in education. And we're seeing massive improvements in girls' performance simply by doing that. And I think another very important area is specifically or intentionally addressing STEM, which is sort of science, technology, engineering, mathematics fields, in which across Africa, and again, indeed, much of the world, girls often are underperforming versus boys. And this is largely because of cultural pressures. Girls are implicitly told as they get older that they're not meant to be in the sciences. That might be something like a teacher giving more time for boys to speak about those issues, or parents pressing girls, as the professor mentioned a moment ago, to be doing the dishes instead of her science homework. We've addressed that with the European Union in South Africa, a really great program that the minister earlier referenced, Teaching for All. And in that program, we help new teachers through sort of methodologies to make sure that girls get that opportunity in core subjects so that they are able to thrive just as much as boys. And we've seen real tangible evidence of that making a difference across South Africa. And then the last one that I really wanted to talk about is sort of getting girls to have fun in education. In Kenya and South Africa, we've launched a sort of hashtag learning to code program where we're working with the ministries there to get girls in coding clubs and to see sciences and coding and technology as something that's open to girls and girls can thrive in. So I think those are actually pretty easy things from the big picture perspective, low cost investments we can make that give us enormous impact on girls' education. And you know, something that struck me the other day, Fifi, was I was looking at, I think it was a World Bank report that said for every 10% of girls we get into an education system, a country's GDP goes up 3%. And that's a very, very powerful number and shows why this is such an important issue.
No, so certainly powerful indeed, and I think the economic case for ensuring that more girls stay in education has aptly been made by Andrew. And I like the point that you are making in terms of the gender-blind approach to teaching. I think that a lot of educators perhaps who are on this call, it would be great, or it is great that such awareness is being raised. Perhaps some are not even aware of their own internal biases. But just pushing on and just getting an example or seeing what is happening on the continent by way of trying to improve education for girls. We're going to head over to Kano, which is the second largest city in Nigeria after Lagos, and is also the capital city of Kano State. So let's take a look at how Kalma, the Kano Literacy and Mathematics Accelerator, is improving the education of girls.
The Kano Literacy and Mathematics Accelerator program was launched in October 2019 in two local government areas of Dawakin Tofa and Wudil in Kano State to address the challenges faced in equipping pupils with basic foundational skills in English, Hausa, and mathematics. The approach is rooted in teaching at the right level approach and has piloted the dual language method for foundational skills in English.
The boy is running.
From the beginning, when the pupils are in the class of paragraph and sentence, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, they will improve their maybe English or Hausa skills, then they will jump to story level. As far as the maths is concerned, when the pupils are in 2 digits, as a result of the method of Kalma, they will jump into maybe subtraction or division.
Everything about the approach, the teaching at the right level approach, is entirely learner-centered.
The pupils were given materials, worksheets, books, flashcards, etc. to enhance their learning experience.
And so let's stay on that topic, that point on how learners learn, both boys and girls, but whether there is a room for improvement in improving the learning experience and to what degree the language of instruction can help in that process. And Professor Vuyo, I know you speak about this quite extensively. I was looking at videos ahead of the conversation, just in which you were talking about the language of instruction. In your view, to what degree can the language of instruction improve the learning outcome and also improve the access of quality education for the girl child?
Thank you, Fifi. That's a very, very good question and very relevant in our context, especially in our African context. Because we are grappling with the issue of the language of instruction across the continent. It's not a South African issue only. So that's very relevant. Well, the language of instruction can either be a facilitator or a barrier to learning. Because it's common sense that if you learn to your home language, you will think better and you will perform better, because even in expressing yourself, you know what you're talking about. Whereas if you learn in an unfamiliar language, there are so many things that come into play, your confidence, your problem in expressing yourself very well, even if you know what you're talking about. So the issue of the language of instruction is close to my heart. And within our context as a continent now, we are a multilingual a continent. We have so many languages. I think more than 2,000, if I'm correct, in Africa. And in our South African context, we also have more than we have 11 official languages. So it's very important that we look at the role of language in terms of teaching and learning. And because we are a multicultural and a multilingual country, I think it is important that what is done in schools translates to what our policy says. Our policy promotes multilingualism, and by multilingualism, it means you must be able to function fully well in many languages, in more than one language. So what that means, if a learner is learning, as I said, through an unfamiliar language, there are many risks. And there's a lot that is written about that. The dropout rates are very high. In our context in South Africa, we see that from the level of basic education, where learners who are not taught through their home language perform poorly or do not achieve better results when compared to those that are taught in their home languages, which in our case would be English and Afrikaans-speaking learners. And that starts from basic education and it goes up to higher education, that is tertiary education. And the statistics to that, I mean, it's obvious that those, if you look, for example, at the dropout rate in higher education, most of those students who drop out are mainly from the poor communities, mostly rural and disadvantaged. And the most important thing is that the language that is used for teaching and learning is not their home language. So we cannot run away from the fact that the language of instruction is crucial in terms of accessing knowledge in any teaching and learning situation, whether it's basic education or higher education. But perhaps, I said from the beginning, we need to look into solutions. I think we know about those issues. Across the country, across the world, we know that you learn better, you access knowledge better in your home language. But I think we need to look at solutions as what we can do to make the situation better. And I think given that we promote multilingualism, I think the basis should be on embracing the resources, the linguistic resources, and the cultural resources that the children bring to school. And the linguistic resources is the home language. All children go to school, and what they carry along with is their home language. Sure. And if we can build on that in terms of promoting additive bilingualism or multilingualism, that means instead of taking away the learner's home language, we must build on it so that we don't create a case of subtractive bilingualism. So I think what we need to do is to embrace the learner's home language because it enables them to learn better and to have a better epistemological access to learning.
Okay. Ma'am, I'm going to come in there. I'm going to come in there because I want to ask you, I mean, at what point then in embracing the home language, at what point then do we make the switch to English?
Yes.
Because outside of the classroom, in the workplace, and if this child should want to visit other parts of the world, English is generally one of those languages that it's easier to conversate with a whole lot more people, and it is the language of instruction in most corporates. So at what point is the ideal point to make the switch?
Okay, that's a very good question, Fifi. I think, first of all, we must understand the two issues here. The learning of language as a subject, right? And the use of the language as a medium of instruction. Those are two different issues. So learning a language, we have to expose our learners to many languages, English and so on, because we are promoting multilingualism, all right? But it's not necessary that English is the only language of instruction, that is, all the subjects are taught through it. And coming to your question as to at what level would the transition be better, my own research shows that we must first build strong home language skills for our learners to be able to transition better into an additional language or a second language. And there's a lot written about that. So in our case, in our South African context, for example, the switch is at grade 4, which is the start of the intermediate phase. And you must remember that when these young learners switch from their home language, through which they were taught for 3 years, their home language skills are still underdeveloped. They are still trying to find themselves in their own home languages. And then now, for me, I believe that it is very, very early for them to switch to English as the main home language. And go back to my earlier comment. Let's distinguish between learning English as a subject and using English as a home language. And if we learn from the bigger world, from the developed countries, teaching and learning happens in the learners' home languages, but they learn English. They are proficient in English. What is it that we are not doing correctly? And I think we need to ask ourselves that question and learn from other countries outside Africa, outside the African continent, as to how do they do it.
Okay. Let me jump in there, because you have asked a question, and maybe let's get a few of the other speakers, perhaps Andrew, to weigh in on that. Andrew, just your view on the language of instruction and the ideal point to make that switch if the language of instruction within the schools, in fact most African schools, is not in English.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just to say, I actually agree very much with Professor Nomlomo and her point there, that it's absolutely critical that we build foundational literacy of children in their home language. Why is that important? It builds their confidence. It makes them feel that they're gaining from education, incentivizing them and their parents to remain in the education system. And as I said, one of the big reasons why that's so important is to keep them in school and therefore out of early child marriage or pregnancy, in addition to all the economic benefits. Now, at what point does it make sense for us to look at children learning in a language that isn't their home language, like English? And that the answer really is, it depends on the child, and it depends on how fluent they have now become in that second language. So you'll see countries in the Nordics, for example, in Scandinavia, where children, because of television and their environment, have become very fluent in English at a very early age. And in those environments, it might make sense to start switching over children relatively early into an English curriculum, assuming that they've already built confidence in their home language. But that isn't the case in most African countries, where home language literacy, again, those foundational skills, literacy in their home language, is so critical. So first you build that, and then you can start introducing other mediums of instruction. And I think that the professor also made a really key point there. Teaching, say, science in your home language doesn't preclude you from learning English as its own subject. And that is something that you can start at quite an early age. So I think you can teach English, but you should keep instruction of the general subjects in the home language until there's sufficient literacy in both.
Right, and I think it's just speaking to the point that you did make a little earlier, Andrew, in terms of teaching at the right level. Would be interested to hear if any of the viewers who are watching, or any of the speakers on the Hop-In, the audience members rather on Hop-In, have anything to say about this. Feel free to share any questions or any comments about the language of instruction. And as you do that, let's push over to Kenya, where we hear what the high school students there have to say about school and learning and the place of girls in the system.
The changes that I would love to see in my school is that I would like to see more emphasis being put on the STEM subject, that is science, technology, engineering and mathematics. But also we should not sideline the art-related subjects, because that will give students a chance to showcase their talents.
A change that I want to see in my community is the mentality of underrating girl child education to be eradicated.
One of the things that makes it difficult for girls to learn and do well in school is poverty. The level of poverty might not even allow the girl to come to school because the parents would rather go for basic needs instead of education for the girl.
In future, I would like to be a lawyer so that I can defend those people who are not able to defend themselves. I would also like to be in a better financial position so that I can support and sponsor those children who are not able to pay their fees.
Mr. President, I would like you to finance more on educational sector so as we can have enough facilities at our schools so as to improve our education. And also, I would like you to provide girls with sanitary towels to give them more time at school.
Mr. President, I'd like to request that laws under child protection should be made more strict and that it should be everyone's responsibility.
This is my heartfelt request to you, Mr. President, that you may help make school a memorable place. And this will be through providing improved or even the best infrastructure in the education sector, and also allowing for the best and most qualified teachers to be in our schools. This will allow each and every child's heart to be met with the greatness and the impact of education. Thank you.
All right, those are quite reasonable asks made by some of the learners over in Kenya to the president. And one of the learners did mention the issue of STEM subjects. And Andrew, I think it feeds on to what you had highlighted first, in the fact that we do see a lot more boys than girls in this field. And Lena, I'd like to get your comments here, because I know that you are quite active in the space of encouraging a lot more girls towards STEM subjects with the various initiatives that you do run. Can you perhaps, in your view, talk to the lack of young girls in the field to start off with, but also what you're trying to do to address it?
Women only make around 28%. That already tells you that there's a lot of work to be done, and it does not need to be done after tertiary education. It needs to be done in the formative stages of these girls' life. So the fellow panelists had talked about gender norms and stereotypes, which are some of the barriers to girl education. But one key barrier which maybe we've not addressed is the imposter syndrome. That a girl would not do something unless she's so sure that she's going to succeed in it. And that brings in the point of lack of mentors in the STEM field. Because of the low number of women in the STEM field, we see that girls really do not have mentors or role models to reassure them that once they venture in that field, they're going to thrive just like their male counterparts. So what have I done? I started what we call the Girls in STEM Club in my school. And in this club, I ensure that I invited women mentors who have made it in the field of science. Okay, it is very easy for us to get male pilots, male engineers. Boys always see these people everywhere. Everywhere they go, they meet them they see them in books. But girls, it is very rare for you to come across such women who are thriving in the field of STEM. So one thing which girls need is mentorship or role models in this field. The other thing which I think we also need to take in of is what we call the gender responsive pedagogy, because we see that boys and girls, they have different learning needs. So there's a way a teacher can tailor-make her pedagogy to ensure that girls are more engaged, that girls are more inspired to venture into the STEM field. And teachers really play a critical role. One, in the methodology they apply in classroom, and two, even in the language. I remember the good professor from South Africa talked about language of instruction. So in this aspect, how do teachers affect girls' desire in STEM? If in the course of a lesson, a teacher makes a remark such as, girls, you don't need to work hard. The boys will marry you. You just need to get some grade and you'll be married. That's a very loose remark, which might discourage girls from working hard or making it in the field they aspire to make it in. The other thing is when these girls are choosing their subjects, then you keep asking them, are you sure you're going to make it in physics? You see, physics is for boys. So such remarks actually make girls to doubt their capability, whether they can really make it in the field of STEM. So what I think we should champion for is a very intentional professional teacher development in the area of gender responsive pedagogy, as well as in the area of digital literacy, because we've seen that technology is an equalizer. And if teachers can effectively use technology in their classroom, one, they'll encourage more girls to participate, even in the sciences, more girls will be able to participate. Their performance will be boosted, and they'll be able to get the entry mark to enable them pursue STEM in the tertiary levels of education.
Right.
Lina,
thanks, Lina. Just staying with you, though, the points that you did make about the teacher professional development, as well as the transformation of the gender responsive pedagogy. I had to practice that word. But pedagogy. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
So who would be responsible in leading that initiative? Towards that transformation? It sounds pretty complex, but it does need to be done. So whose responsibility is it to ensure that it is done?
Yes. So number one, in the 21st century, it should be the responsibility of the teacher themselves, because teachers need to embrace professional development. Our classroom is changing very fast, and if the teachers remain with the skills with which they were trained in training colleges, then they'll not fit in the 21st century classroom. Number two, the school leaders should be very intentional about coming up with professional development policy, and key among them to see that their schools are gender responsive. So that would be in terms of even the infrastructure they have in schools. We know that girls would need different toilets from what boys are using. We know that girls would need more clean water for their sanitation during menstruation. So these are the roles that school leaders would play to ensure that even their own staff are inspired to embrace gender responsive pedagogy.
All right. Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Lina, for that. And Aisha, too, I know you had a comment earlier that you wanted to respond to. Just feel free to respond now, ma'am.
I wanted to respond to the issue of language of instruction. And I think Andrew has mentioned what I wanted to say. It is very, very important because it creates confusion if the language of instruction in other subjects like sciences, like all the other subjects taught in English, you find the students unable to express themselves, unable to express themselves well. So language of instruction, as is given in the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria and the National Policy of Education, the switch is in the primary 4 or basic 4. But I feel that it needs to be raised up maybe to primary 5. But also parents, community members need to be brought on board, because some people feel that they want their children to be speaking English from day one, but that is not positive for the learning of the children and for their potentials, for them to harness their potentials as they should. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. Thanks, ma'am. And just sticking with you just for a moment further, it was raised earlier, but I'd just like to understand your experience on the ground there in Nigeria, just to the degree to which some cultural and religious norms also prevent girls from staying in the school system as long as they should, falling out because of factors like early marriages, which Andrew also highlighted in his commentary. But talk to us about the experience in Nigeria and just some of the actions and the interventions that should be made in this regard to keep as many girls in the system as possible.
Thank you very much, Fifi. Yes, culture does play a significant role in the retention, completion, and transition of girls in school. But it depends on the perception. And I call it more of syncretism, because there are negative social norms that affect girls' participation in the schools, and there is also a misperception that religion also has an impact on making girls, or as a barrier to girls' education. But religion, to my knowledge, does not serve as an obstacle to girls' education. No religion prohibits girls' education, but rather it is kind of what I call syncretism. Religion being closed in the gap of culture, and that is being used to prevent girls from going to school. There are several interventions that take care of these negative social norms that affect girls and prevent them from attending schools. For instance, community engagement, where members of the community, advocacy is conducted with members of the community, the traditional rulers. For instance, I'm a member of the high-level women advocates, an FCDO-supported UNICEF intervention, where we advocate always for the education of the girl child, and we advocate to all necessary key stakeholders, whether it is the religious leaders, whether it is the traditional community, influencers in the society, parents, and the rest. We advocate, show them the significance of girls' education, and the religious leaders help us in creating awareness that religion does not hinder girls' education. Coming from Kano State, the northern Nigeria, religious leaders, we advocate with religious leaders, and they do that in their pulpits when they meet with their followers and during khutbahs or Friday prayers. So all this, there is also the organization of girls groups, like the Girls for Girls, peer-led learning, which encourage the girls to participate in and to remain in school, to mobilize other girls to come back to school. And Mothers Association also help in bringing girls back to school. The community, whether SBMC, whether CBMC, they also help in bringing girls back to school.
Okay.
And are very, very important. Okay, over. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry to rush you, ma'am. We are running out of time for this discussion, but of course we will be continuing for the members who will be joining us on the next platform, Hop In, where we'll be answering all your questions. But before we do wrap up the discussion, finally, I'd like to get some closing remarks from the panel. Literally a minute each. I'd like to give you all a minute each, just to sum up what success looks like for you in the next 5 years in terms of investing in intentional education for girls in your respective countries. So, Professor Voyo, in a minute, what does that success look like for you?
Thank you, Fifi. I would like to see an inclusive curriculum which is packaged both for pre-service and in-service training in terms of gender issues. I'm not sure as to what extent, particularly with regard to our teacher education, to what extent do we expose our student teachers to gender issues that prevail in the classrooms. So I would like to see that, and I would like to see a great commitment both from the government, which is already giving in terms of prioritizing girls' education, but I think we need to have collaboration with other stakeholders, particularly parents, because some of these stereotypes come from home. So I would like to see collaboration, close collaboration with different stakeholders.
All right. Lina, for yourself, what does that success look like in relation to being intentional about the education for girls in Kenya?
Very well. So in Kenya currently, the statistics has it that 13,000 girls drop out of school every year, because of teenage pregnancy. So to me, success would be if this number could be reduced to 0. If you could see that no girl dropped out of school because of teenage pregnancy, this could be done through sex education and making them aware of their reproductive health. Secondly, you've seen the number of women in the field of STEM, there are only 28%. So if you could have at least more than 50% between the two genders taking up STEM subjects, especially in tertiary institutions of education, then to me, I would count that as a success.
All right.
Thank you, Fifi.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for staying within your minute. Aisha, too, ma'am, you, a success in relation to intentional education for girls in Sub-Saharan Africa and Nigeria specifically.
Yes, I would like to see safe, secure, and girl-friendly schools that provide free and quality education and provide also prevent girls from radicalization. I would also like to see a significant reduction in gender-based violence. So many girls are dropping out of school. So many girls are not going back to school as a result of gender-based violence, either within the school, outside the school, as a result of emergencies, as a result of conflict, protracted crisis. That I would like to see. I would like to see also a significant improvement or in reduction of poverty, because that makes girls to be engaged in hawking, to be not to go to school, and the issue of preference of enrolling boys rather than girls, as well as also effective implementation of more girls' schools close to the communities.
All right.
Build provision so that they are motivated to enroll and improved mobility for girls.
Okay.
I think I'd like this. Thank you.
All right, thanks, ma'am. And lastly, Andrew, a parting shot from yourself, your parting message to perhaps all stakeholders in the game, from the teachers to the principals to the governments and even maybe to the learners themselves, in terms of what needs to be done in advancing education for girls further on the continent.
Thank you very much, Fifi, and really an honor to be with all of you. I think it's really about us as the sort of donor and education community looking at all the different tools we have, because we have many. We've been working on this for decades. And it's one, being intentional, which is what you said at the beginning, but two, looking at those tools and saying, what is the smartest approach? What are we going to get the biggest bang for our buck? And so to stick within my minute, my three answers are, I think, one, focused on teaching at the right level. So making sure that we're grouping people by skill set instead of just by age. Secondly, engaging girls in STEM subjects, making it fun, doing after-school clubs, etc. Making sure that teachers know how to engage girls in this area and not just subconsciously preferring boys. And lastly, working on foundational skills. So we talked about foundational literacy. I think by doing that with all the stakeholder groups, Fifi, you just mentioned, school leaders, teachers, parents, and indeed the learners themselves, we will see huge improvements in girls' education across this continent in the next 5 years.
All right. Thank you, and thank you. Nothing further to add there, and thanks for sticking to your minute as we have come towards the end of this special broadcast for CNBC Africa viewers. And for those who are watching on the Hop-In platform, please do stay tuned for a very interactive Q&A with the panelists. So that's exactly where we will address some of the questions and comments that you have been making. And once again, just a last thank you for the CNBC Africa viewers to our speakers for today, Andrew Zerzan, the Director for Education of Arts and Civil Society for Sub-Saharan Africa at the British Council, who is based in Kenya. We also have Dr. Vuyokazi Nomlomo, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Teaching and Learning at the University of Zululand in South Africa. Professor Aishatu Abdul-Isma'il from the Department of Political Science, Bayero University, Kanu in Nigeria, as well as Lina Angango, the Global Teacher Prize finalist from Kenya. So for now, goodbye to the CNBC Africa viewers. Thanks so much for your time. We're switching over to Hop-In, and we're going to end this broadcast with one more pack to play. And in it is a few Kenyan girls who share their poetry through the audio film Poetry in Schools program. Goodbye.
I see dry vegetation, plants covered in sand, no water, no warmth, no light. I see people digging fingers into earth for food while others plant their heads. I see poverty's dry skin caused by the same skin. I see treasury reserves drying, taxmen squeezing dry coffers, and always the same dry ideas from dried up men in shiny shoes. How will we change this dry mentality? In the slums and suburbs, this shared fragility, all of us living in the same vicinity, enduring the same aridity, dry enough to break skin. Excuse me, we haven't even talked about gender equality, people living with disability, vaccines, our girls getting kidnapped, and where our classmates who haven't returned are. The list won't fit into a neat rhyme. Maybe we should water our minds, moisturize, work towards the light for our communities, and plant new seeds together.
A feeling of helplessness surrounding me, being pessimistic of how my future will be, fear making my blood freeze, living a life through a merciless cold breeze, feeling like a mosquito in this world.
This, I promise. I won't hide and cower away. I won't sit still and fade away. I will be a brave warrior. This I promise.
Do they know that we've got dreams? The times are over when girl child had no say. Our bright brains are burning to reflect their sparkling rays.